All of you, and very good morning to people who are joining from other parts of the world. And welcome to the 13th webinar of the Roundtable series, our evidence based action policy roundtables. Today's webinar is titled Governance and Coordination for Strengthening Rural Institutions. Our webinar has invited discussion on the merits and contradictions of delivering development through decentralized local governance systems and how coordination, peace, and partnerships are important for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So, specifically, this webinar kind of focuses on the SDG 17 and SDG 16 as well. This webinar will be delivered by two very eminent scholars and practitioners in the field. First, we have Dr. Louis Mullivan, who is the Director of Public Strategy for Sustainable Development, which is PS4SD, and based in Brussels, Belgium. He will be presenting his work on public administration and governance for the SDGs, navigating between change and stability. The panel is also joined by Professor Dr. Jiju P. Alex, who will talk about the public administration and governance for the SDGs. Dr. Alex works with the decentralization at the Kerala State Planning Board. Now, I will be introducing our speakers in detail before I hand over the mic now. And in between, when our Director General joins, I will be requesting him to make a welcome comment. Moving on to the introduction to our first panelist, our first presentation of the day, we have Professor Dr. Louis Mulliman. He is an academic practitioner and trainer on sustainability governance and meta-governance and policy coherence and integration. He is the visiting professor, public governance at KU Leuven University at Belgium, member and currently vice chair of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration. He is the vice chair of the Scientific Committee of the European Environment Agency and a member of the Global Council for SDG 17 at UAE. During his 40 years of public administration experience at subnational, national, European, and UN level, he was, among others, head of the unit rural areas at the former Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning, and the Environment of the Netherlands. Later, he was director of the Dutch Science Policy Advisory Council, that is RMNO, and from 2011 to 20, he was the policy coordinator at the European Commission. Uh, just one moment. He has a PhD in public administration and an MSc in environmental biology. His latest book is Meta Governance for Sustainability, and as co-founder of the think tank Public Strategy for Sustainable Development, he advises, among others, national governments, the European Commission, UN bodies, and the OECD on SDG implementation challenges. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Mulliman for his time, for agreeing to take the session. And I would like to hand over the mic to you for going ahead with your presentation today, which is Governance and Coordination for Strengthening Rural Institutions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for these kind words, and good afternoon from Brussels, where it is still early in the morning and far away from lunch. It's an honor to be able to address you in this way, in this webinar series. You already got a long introduction about my background, but I would like to say a few more words on that, because background is also context. Next slide, please. Could you try to, yeah, exactly. So, because my background, like it was said by Ruchira, I have a 40 years background in policy making and thinking about that. 10 years was in the Netherlands on environment, groundwater, and soil protection, but it was a subnational level. And then I worked at the national level in the Netherlands, among others, on my favorite topic of rural areas, which was not the favorite topic in the Ministry of Planning, because most people found the urban areas much more important than the rural things. But gradually, I gathered more people, more staff, more resources, and it became more important then. But it was a good period, because I learned a lot about the relations between urban and rural development and institutions. Then I worked 10 years at the European Commission, mainly on horizontal governance issues. Next slide, please. And I would like to give some food for thought, but my central thesis is, I think, that there is no one size fits all solution to the question on, do we need centralized or decentralized decision-making institutions? But for each constellation, the success factor, the real factor is having a well-functioning multi-level governance arrangement that works, that is dynamic, and that ensures good communication and good collaboration. And I will go into that a bit more. And just to illustrate, this is yeah. Please go to the next slide. To illustrate, these are just a few things, and you know them all very well. That there are always arguments to do something in a centralized way. For example, it takes a bit away the NIMBY arguments, not in my backyard arguments, and that's why sometimes you can do things better on the distance. And also the issue of scale. At the local scale, you don't have the resources. Of course, local authorities are often then pool their resources, which is a good approach. But on the national or higher scale, it's easier. There are good arguments to decentralize. It's closer to citizens, that creates more ownership and it's better local knowledge. When I was director in the past of this Science Policy Advisory Council to the government in the Netherlands, I think it took us 1 year to convince the ministry in The Hague that they had a wrong approach. They wanted to know how they could decentralize national knowledge to the local level or to the provincial level, because I thought, okay, we want to decentralize, so then we have to decentralize the knowledge. And that was wrong thinking, because the knowledge has to be made for policy making at the level where you take the decisions, because there you know the context, you know the specific knowledge of the local parties. But it took a long time because they had to rethink and had to realize that you cannot just decentralize knowledge. It has to be made where it has to be used. And of course, at the decentral level, you have more tailored solutions to local circumstances. Next slide, please. And yes, okay. And then talking about policy and governance, that is one of my favorite topics. It is very important to have a good balance, and most policymakers love policy. Politicians too. They love the policy, the goals, the targets, the timelines, and so on. And most find the governance part boring. And that's a big risk, because the governance part is about the how to get where you want to go. So it's the difference between what and how. And this how part is just as important. And that's where the institutions are, the processes, the political processes, the participation, the mechanism, the tools to get where you want to be. Um, so this is a very important distinction, and you could put it as yin and yang. You could say these are two sides of the same coin. But in all my life, I worked a lot in environmental policy making, where you typically have people who are really driven by the content, by the substance, by the goals, and they think this, unless they are lawyers or something, and they think that the nitty-gritty of governance is not important, and that's why many of these policies fail. So this is an important thing to get a good balance. Next slide, please. You can also see this in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. 15 of the 17 are more the content, the substantial goals, and only 16 and 17 are I call them the enabling goals or the governance goals. What is good is that we have one target, 1714, on policy coherence for sustainable development. That's a very important target. It's also developed into an indicator, meanwhile, but a difficult one to apply. But it has 8 sub-indicators, you could say. And these sub-indicators from 1 to 8, they could almost be a proxy for governance, for sustainable development, because the most important things are there. It's about political commitment and leadership, having a long-term vision, the integration of different dimensions, policy dimensions, the whole of government coordination, horizontal. If I needed to pick one of these 8 as the proxy of all the proxies, then it would be number 4, horizontal coordination in the government at any level is the key, and then the other things can be developed. But subnational engagement, of course, this is thought from the national level, because the SDGs are considered as something where start implementation at the national level. Stakeholder engagement, um, policy and financing impacts also financial finances to make the policy coherence better, and monitoring, reporting, and evaluation. So it's always an uphill battle. As you can see, it is a graph, moving graph, but there is a lot in it, and I think we should really pay a lot of attention to the governance dimension and not only on the political dimension. Let's move to the next one. And when we talk about governance as the how and not the what, then you need to distinguish, you can distinguish three different approaches. And I really like to work with it as a former practitioner, not as a theoretical academic, but as a practitioner, that you can, in fact, always distinguish the hierarchical approach, the top-down approach with the typical instruments of that, a networking approach, a collaborative approach, you could say, and a market governance approach, which is more using market tools and instruments in government or running government, like a company, with all focus on efficiency and not on effectiveness. And it's very logical. I mean, this nice picture from illustrating what Maslow once said: if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And the point is that many problems are not nails. Some problems look like eggs, and you need a different thing than a hammer to work on that. So that's a very simple explanation why it is good to have these things. And combining these three and understanding how you could make a useful mix of the three governance styles, that is called meta governance. It's governance of governance. And next slide, please. And that's not so easy because these three styles are, they have a strong internal logic. Each of the three are like, you could say, the planets, or they are different cultures, even. You can think in a hierarchical way, and you can uh, solve all problems in a hierarchical way. It's rational, it's about reliability and stability, all good things, authoritative, and so on. But the network governance believers, people believe in one of these styles often. They believe in partnerships, in collaboration, and co-creation. That's all very good, and trust is very important. And then you have the market approach, market style, also rational. It's very much cost-driven, flexible, competition as a motivation to change things. And so all three are okay and good, but usually in each country there is one style or a mixture of two of the three styles that is most dominant in everything you do at all levels. And although there are differences in the Netherlands, in my home country, people in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam, two cities, they tick in a different way. So they use different ways to solve problems, and politicians take different types of decisions. But still, it's good to distinguish this and use that as a kind of a toolbox. And this you can also apply to multi-level governance. So how is the collaboration between central and decentralized governments? In the next slide, please. Yeah, the two typical approaches of multi-level governance are top-down or bottom-up, you could say. And the top-down style is the links to the hierarchical governance you have at the highest level. For example, and I take the European Commission, Europe as an example. We have an executive in Europe, the European Commission, and together with the European Parliament and the countries, the member states, they take a decision, and then it goes to the national government. They have to implement it. Sometimes they put it in national law, and then they put it to regional, subnational government or local government, and this whole process can take 7 years or something, and that's a long time, and that's of course, as you know, the case with every lawmaking takes time, and that means that every law is only working in force at the moment that it's not real, that the things have changed, that the surroundings, the context has changed. So it's always too late, more or less. That's why you can. That's why I'm coming from this culture in the Netherlands, which is a typical network culture, horizontal, not so very hierarchical culture. And I always find it difficult to believe how you can believe that you can solve every problem with the law, because laws are always too late. But laws are important. Okay, and then the other style is the subsidiarity principle. which is usually used to say that you have to solve the problem at the lowest level of administration that can handle a problem. And so you start looking at the local government. Can you do that? Then the other subnational governments, then the national, and some things you have to solve at the European level. And in Europe, this is always a discussion and sometimes also a little bit a game. The European Commission, of course, always wants to do more centrally, and the member states wants to do things at the national level. So a few years ago, the European Commission was a bit annoyed about the president of the European Commission was a bit annoyed about this mechanism, and where the European Commission is always gets the blame from the member states. So he suggested that the European members, the 27 member states, should decide for themselves if there is a change in the summertime or winter time, the change of time we do in many countries to save daylight saving time or something like that. And then, of course, yeah, and the countries said, yes, yes, we want to decide this ourselves, not European level. This is typically we can do something. And then it turned out that all countries wanted to have the same time switch moment as their neighboring countries, and they couldn't agree. And then after about half year of discussion, they said, European Commission, can you please take this back and take a European solution? So that's a bit a game that's always happening. But still, if you have this principle of subsidiarity, it means that you believe, and that's also logical, that a lot of innovation happens at the local level, at the subnational level. That's very innovative, um, and but it can take a long time before such innovations at the subnational level can be scaled up to a national or supranational level. So that's also so. But what we have is the two classical ways are both slow in a way, and but they are good and function and slow, and that's why. And if you can give one more click on this PowerPoint slide, Roger, yes, thank you. Then you can see there is a third approach. It is happening in practice, but not so often. And this is what I call real-time collaborative multi-level governance. And that is having a mechanism to sit together with all the different levels now and then, and especially when there is an urgent problem that cannot wait for 5 or 7 years, that sit together and not discuss first discuss who should do what, but first, can we agree on what is the problem, what is the urgency, who has the knowledge to do things, and so that's a quite a different way, and that fits with the network governance paradigm. So, and then you have now, in fact, the choice of three different approaches to collaboration between national and subnational levels, which can be combined and being switched between. But this middle level is something that is important because there are just a lot of problems we have. And I'm coming to the crisis situation, crisis context in a minute. There are a lot of problems that are more urgent than others. And then you cannot just wait for 5 or 7 years. Um, let's move to the next because now I have a few slides on this crazy context where we all are. And I know that all generations always have said our time is the craziest time that has ever existed, and the youth of our time is the most terrible of all times. That applies for every generation, but still we are facing really difficult issues, and sometimes this is called we have to work in the VUCA world, the voluntary the uncertainty, the complexity, and the ambiguity of the world around us, where we have to prepare decisions, is a problem. Next slide, please. Um, and we have a poly crisis sometimes at all levels, and you're confronted with we have the pandemic, we have crisis related to climate change. And that means that crisis governance is important. And what I see in Europe, but in other countries also, is that governments have moved to crisis management, to crisis governance as the most important thing. And that's great because crisis governance means you have unlimited power in a crisis, you have unlimited resources, you need emergency legislation, which means we can set aside parliament, we can set aside stakeholders, not looking for the best knowledge, not long-term thinking. We have to have a solution now, today. And this kind of governance tends to be addictive. The nice examples of that. The simple example is that a police commander in the Netherlands once told me, when there is a crisis, that's the moment where I order new computers for my staff, because nobody dares to say no in a crisis. So next slide, please. And the problem is, and I'm sure you will also recognize it, that uh, most of the current crises are at the same time complex problems and also wicked problems. They call them wicked problems. So wicked problems, difficult to define, non-linear, ambiguous, many different types. Sometimes you only can go for small wins. There's not one organization that can solve it. That could also result in paralysis. And then next click, please. And some of these problems, like the big problems, could you click one more time? Some of these problems are called super wicked problems. It doesn't appear. Could you try to click one slide? Yes, thank you. Some of them are called super wicked problems. Time is running out. We have a weak central authority to do this, and policy responses are not looking into the future and impacts in an irrational way. And next slide, please, because I'm almost to the end. Yes, this one you could skip, and the next one there, because they were double. Please, and this one too. I only discovered it early this morning. Yes, thank you. So we have a kind of a paradox. To address the poly crisis, or the perma crisis even, at the same time, we need fast governance, the crisis management. We have to do things now, hierarchical tools, laws, and we have to do it in a slow way because addressing wicked problems is not a fast thing. So we have to do, and the economic psychologist Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, wrote his famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And that's what we need to do in governance at the moment. What could we do about that? Raise awareness of the paradox. And the paradox is a seemingly contradictory situation. So it is solvable in a way. Maybe you need some training, you need bold political decisions. In the European Union, the Green Deal and the green transition and digital transition is still very, very high on the highest on the political agenda, although we have had this crisis, but they are now linked to the crisis recovery guidance. Next slide. Yes, very quickly. And then we also have to understand a little bit more about these different governance styles and how you do things, how you solve problems. There is the command style of the hierarchical thinking is important for crisis. For complexity, you need the network style a bit, and the market governance style is very good for routine issues. And you shouldn't involve too many stakeholders in routine issues. You have to do it in an efficient way. This is number 46 of 50 differences, which I put in my last book, between these two styles. Then, next slide. Important also is not only which style works best for which type of problem, but also how do you frame problems? Because as politicians know that a problem doesn't exist, problem is constructed, is framed. I mean, there are real problems, but still you can frame problems in a different way. So different ways of thinking lead to different framing. You see in hierarchical governance, the nice example of Germany is a very hierarchical culture country. So they think that this is complete chaos. When you see the four paper clips, in my culture, it's almost perfect order. And the people in my country don't really see very quickly that the fourth paperclip is twisted, is not laying in the same order. In the network culture, problems are framed as lack of consensus, and in market culture, it's about inefficiency. Last slide, more or less, I think. No one? Yes, next one, please. I'm taking too much time, I'm sorry. Something about framing and reframing. When I worked in the Netherlands in the rural area ministry or department, um, we had a very important frame. Protecting rural areas begins with making cities compact. So we prevented cities to take more land to, and we did this with not with the argument to protect the rural areas, but with the argument that if you have compact cities, it's better you can have better public transport, and all kind of facilities are easier to finance and to organize. An important thing that also happened in those days in the 1990s was about water governance. Uh, we had a switch then in the Netherlands from fighting against water and building ever higher dikes against flooding to giving the water more room and to working with water. And this is still the important principle of dealing with water and with floods in the Netherlands. You cannot just build the dikes sky high. Last slide. Indeed, this was based on the article for which I was asked to speak. That was 2 years ago. In this article, where I said there are like at that moment four big issues that need to be worked on. The first is making public administration and governance a strategic policy area. That's usually not the case. It is considered as something it's almost like human resources, public administration quality or governance quality. Thinking about that is not a policy, but it should be a policy area. It is politically very important not only to think about the what, but also about the how. Secondly, and we need reforms that have a purpose. Many government reforms are only aimed at more efficiency, but that's not should not be the purpose. And that's why it's good to have the sustainable development goals. And so reforms in these times should be focused on that, I think. Mission-oriented public administration reform. The third is understand this concept of three different governance styles with personal and whatever governance, governmental and organizational preferences, but understand that you can mix and that you sometimes can shift and sometimes not. And the fourth was addressing silo mentality. There are silos between departments, between all kind of organizations, ministries, but my thing is that in the market governance thinking, the thinking is break down the silos. That's the mantra. And I don't think you need to break them down, but you have to make them work together. And using a metaphor, teaching silos to dance. That's the training I developed. And I think that's the idea. Is you have to address silo mentality because the silos itself, the structures are important for credibility and so on and so on. Now I've taken a bit too much time, I think, but this was just giving you some food for thought. I hope it was useful for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Milman. No, of course, it's very interesting because in India, as you know, we have been discussing how to deliver development through this whole system of local governance that we have. Can we decentralize? What will be the form of decentralization? And who will be the agency through which development will be delivered? And of course, there are already discussions around coordination between different departments. There are discussions around contradiction of goals between the ministries within the city government, etc. So in that context, I really invited you to talk about it. And of course, I think once we start developing the policy book, then we will be able to gain your more technical input on that as well. With that, I don't want to take much time. I would like to take a few questions because I know you don't have time. You told me in the morning that you have other engagements. So before moving on to our next speaker, I would like to open the panel a little bit for maybe a few questions, and then we will be able to then we can start with the next speaker. I have given the control to turn on your microphone to our participants. If any of you have any question at this point, please raise your hand, unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then please ask the question and make it very precise, concise, and linked to the topic that is being presented today. Please go ahead. You can unmute now.
Any
Yes, I see.
questions are good, huh? There are no stupid questions. There are only stupid answers, and I'm the one who's giving the stupid answers, I suppose.
Right. I see the first hand raised from Mr. Dinesh. Please unmute yourself. Dinesh Kumar Maurya, please unmute yourself.
Yes, good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Just I want to know, ma'am, our representatives, Mr. Sachin, कि how will we properly monitor all the policies to be improvement of the your organizations? Then how will our aware the proper in community basis?
Your voice is a little disturbed. Can you reframe the question, Mr. Maurya?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Ma'am, just I want to know about this. In that policy is proposed from your organization with you and your team. How will we uh, aware the community in the primary levels?
Right. Okay. So I think he's asking that if the policy is centrally designed and it's not decentralized, and how will the community be aware and we know and connect to the policy that is centrally designed? So that's Dinesh.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Well, that's a good question. Uh, yeah, but yeah, it depends a little bit on how in different policy fields the way how it is communicated between the national and the subnational level can be different. So there's a certain culture. I know in like in infrastructure thinking, infrastructure ministry, it's quite a rational culture normally. Quite open-minded because people think like engineers. In the medical world, I don't know that so much. Um, but in general, I would say that it is, and that what I did when I worked at the national level, of course, in a small country, the Netherlands, but when I worked in the national at the national level um, on a new policy or a new project, I always started with mapping the different stakeholders, not only the societal, the business and NGOs, but also the decentralized governments. What did I think they had um, to bring? What is their stake, their interest in this issue, and do we have a communication with that? And if in this map, which we then draw on a flip over chart, and if there were stakeholders, for example, the Association of Local Authorities, where we said, "Hey, we don't really know what they think about this topic," then we invited them, and then we went for them, and then when we in the map we draw the farmers organization as an actor important for us. Then at a certain moment we said, hey, but they are very conservative. They don't want change. But we discovered there is probably also a young farmers association. So then we went for the young farmers association. So this is what at the central level should happen, that you really make a good map of who is involved and who could be part of solving the problem. Not who is responsible or who's in charge. That's less important. That's later. First, who can bring something and who has something at stake. At the same time, you could do this at the local level because I know of a great project that was a complete failure in the Netherlands, which was done at the local level because the local project manager didn't realize that things were happening outside the scope of his project that influenced the project, and that there was a political component where some of the parties went to the Hague, to the parliament, and to the government to say, hey, what's happening here locally is not okay, we don't agree. So his whole project was failed, not because he didn't realize that there is always something outside the project. So this was a long start of an answer to a good question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Milvan. I think Dinesh ji also has liked the answer I interpret from the emoji that he just sent me. Moving on to our next question, Mr. Ampa Kumar Hembram. Kindly unmute yourself and ask. And after that, we will have only one more question and move on to the next speaker.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. I'm from Government General Degree College, Saloni, which is in West Bengal.
Sound is not so
From
great.
Your voice is highly
Jamshedpur,
disturbed.
Jharkhand.
Right.
I am from
Is it
my
possible to put the
my
question in
home is
the chat box?
Jamshedpur, Jharkhand.
Yeah, we get it.
Hello,
Right, we can
my
hear you. You are from Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. Please go ahead.
okay. Ma'am, sir, in Jharkhand, I where my village is a fifth schedule area. In fifth schedule area is a local governance we called Majhi system or Santal. I am Santal. Belong from Santal community in fifth schedule area. You say your presentation multi-level governance, top to down and down to top. So I ask you to. I saw my area. There are Majhi system or rural governance or the local leaders. They are not aware to this type of system or this type of governance system. And 73rd Amendment of Constitution in India, we have a very 29 subject are इन ग्राम सभा मतलब मैं थोड़ा हिंदी में बोलता हूं मैडम कि ग्राम सभा में 29 सब्जेक्ट को काम करने के लिए अधिकार दिया गया है लेकिन उन्हें पता ही नहीं है तो नेशनल लेवल में तो ये सब बात होते हैं लेकिन ग्राउंड लेवल में इसका काम एकदम जीरो लेवल पे है तो उसको हम लोग किस तरह से काम करेंगे
Right. Let me translate the question to our speaker. He is basically pointing out the contradiction between our central, the 73rd Amendment to our Constitution, which kind of enables this local governance in these areas. And the area that he's talking about is a sixth schedule area, means it's a tribal area, remote area, and they go by these panchayats and local governance system. And the 29 subject areas that he's talking about, the government has basically identified 29 areas of development for, in different linking to different sustainable development goals, and the local governance body is supposed to take it up in collaboration with. But he is saying that the actual agency that is there, the agency of governance, they themselves are not aware of their rights or the kind of entitlements that they do have, which they can mobilize to bring development to that area. And therefore, they think that there's a disconnect between what the government plans centrally and then how the communities actually receive it, or how much they are really empowered to carry on and actually deliver it. So, what can be the model which we can then talk about to bring this disconnect closer? Like, how can we empower the communities to actually use the provision in place? So,
thank you again. A very important question. But there is then clearly a governance gap, you could say, a governance gap, because in the design of this approach with the 29 developing areas, if the awareness raising and the communication is not part of the program of the project, of the centrally thought program, that's a gap, and so. And then, okay, and if this gap and of this lack of awareness of what can be done locally and how it should be done, if that could be, you could ask the central government to repair this problem, to change that, to invest in awareness raising, but that could maybe take a long time, and maybe you can also start from more like the bottom up to like I said, one of the solutions for problems at the local level is sometimes that you can pool resources, that you can bring little bits of money you have together with other local organizations or local authorities, and you can hire the mechanism or the consultant or whatever the expertise that you need for something like that. So you could maybe also sit together and say, okay, we don't have the awareness, we don't have the knowledge yet to really do what needs to be done. So let's see where we can find the knowledge and take our own responsibility from the bottom up. And I don't know this situation in reality, of course, so I cannot really judge anything. But sometimes you can do a little bit more than that. And this is also typically, and then I stop, a situation maybe where the famous mutual gains approach to negotiation could play a role. It's also sometimes called the Harvard negotiation method, where you really sit together with people with different interests and see if you can find win-win solutions or packages. And that's again a whole world apart. But that for such kind of conflicts, it could be a good approach, maybe.
Right. No, it's a very context specific question because he belongs to a very special area with different kind of governance structure. And of course, I mean, there is a coordination issue, and there are other mechanisms through which you can all find solutions to local problems. But his question was specific to the agency of governance that is there, how they can be more empowered to. And so there is a contradiction in India between the bureaucratic system, which is supposed to empower local governance, and the local governance system itself, which is supposed to be empowered on its own. So how do the two bodies kind of work together? And that's a question that we have to continuously ask ourselves and answer. Anyway, let us move on. I think I'll just read out one of the questions which is in the chat box, which is from Mr. K. Nagarajan, and he's asking that how can we make the citizens more accountable and responsible for collective governance? So this is. So the rest of the part, it's not a question. So the first question only I'll ask that how to make the citizens more accountable and responsible for collective governance? Question mark. That's what he's asking.
It's again a question for a whole afternoon
Yes.
discussion, I think. It's fantastic, but it's a really good question. But and there are a lot of discussions on this in the different countries. Um, Generally, I would say don't throw away. I mean, if you want to make citizens more accountable and more involved and more yeah, co-responsible, um, then don't start with breaking down the existing democratic institutions which we have. Sometimes people say, you know, we even have to abolish elections because people have to do it themselves, which is not really very intelligent, I think, because you don't see how this can happen. You create new chaos, but there are ways to get citizens more involved. Um, I think well, one movement in Europe at the moment in many countries and at the central level is to create citizens conferences or citizens meetings. In, for example, here on very complex questions, normally dealt with by specialists,
Yes.
only by experts, and they invite 150 normal citizens from all over Europe. For a long weekend to Brussels, coming to Brussels, and they discuss with experts on this issue, and all their ideas are noted down. But the result is at the end of such a weekend is not only that there are great ideas for the new policy to develop, but also that people feel more empowered and feel listened to, and they go home and they tell the other people, and so this is a could create a snowball effect. And that takes a long time, but this is a great way to get people more um, feeling more yeah, not left behind, more heard, and for the governments it is a good means to understand, to really understand that also non-experts can bring essential information for policy making.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Milman. And I agree that these are questions that will require much more than one single meeting or one single panel. I
Yes,
mean,
yeah.
we can continue to discuss and find solutions. In fact, the citizens' meeting very interesting because in India also, at least at the level, at the rural development level, there are these provisions of huge meetings with the citizens of the villages. They call it the Gram Sabha, which is kind of like a huge gathering of the citizens and then kind of discussing the local problems, bringing out solutions. But how much those solutions can actually be implemented by the agency with the kind of resources they have, that still needs to be seen and evaluated. So with that, let me just break from this question and answer session with your presentation. Of course, if you are still there and we have some time at the end, we will again take some questions for you. I would now
Okay.
like to and I will again like to thank you for your time and agreeing to take the session, and we will definitely be in touch with some more work when we develop the
Yes,
RDP
I
and
will need to move out soon. I'm very sorry, but I will stay another 20 minutes, I hope.
yes, yes.
At
Thank you
least,
so
at
much.
least to the
And
next.
we will get back to you when we talk about the next level, and we would like to work with you on while developing the RD policy, etc. So at the time again, I'll be writing to you to take your inputs. So thank you so much. Now let me move on to our next panelist. He has been waiting patiently for some time, and I would like to now invite him, Professor GGP Alex. So am I audible?
Yes, yes, very much.
Yes. Let me quickly introduce Professor Alex to all of you. Some of you really know him for a long time. I don't really need to give him an introduction, but for the benefit of the larger community, let me introduce Professor Jiju P. Alex is the member of Kerala State Planning Board. He is a graduate from the Kerala Agricultural University and he got his PhD from the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in Delhi. He started his career as a scientist at the Indian Council of Agricultural Research Service, and then moved on to Kerala Agricultural University. He also served the Information Kerala Mission as the head of its Human Resource Development Division. Professor Alex has a vast experience in agriculture and rural development, democratic decentralization, technology, society interference, innovative management, entrepreneurship development, human resource development, and e-governance. He was instrumental in designing the training methodology of the e-governance programs of local self-government institutions. He has led several research projects, guided PhD students, and published widely in the areas of his expertise. Professor Alex is a member of Board of Management of the Kerala Bank. He has also served as member of the academic policy level committees of many academic institutions at the country. At the State Planning Board, he is dealing with decentralization, housing, and art and culture. Welcome, Professor Alex, and thank you for your time. Without wasting much time, I would like to hand over the mic to you, and you can take your presentation from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ruchira, for the nice words, and also good afternoon to everyone. In fact, I have been very keenly listening to Professor Louis Millman, who has worked extensively on governance and also the strategies by which we would be able to accomplish these sustainable development goals, and his international experiences that has given much more insights into the problems which we discuss today. In fact, I would like to draw a few of the concepts that he has presented during his presentation and to try to relate this with the Indian experience. How do we do this? And also would briefly mention on the very unique way of decentralized planning that has been implemented in the state of Kerala following the provisions of the 73rd and 74th Amendment of the Constitution. In fact, I don't have a presentation because I thought I had talked to Rujira and she said it would be for 20 minutes or so. I thought I would speak to you rather than wasting time. Maybe if some technical issues happen in between, that would be a constraint. So I thought I would not go for a PowerPoint presentation. So in fact, we know that the world over, there is a search for effective institutional frameworks to manage and assist rural development, and also to address many of the existing as well as emerging challenges of our times. Professor Mulman has mentioned a few challenges that we currently face. We have the issues of climate change, we have the issues of economic development, and ever so many new things coming up. So it is very important that the rural communities have to be integrated into regional and global opportunities, particularly the value chains. And also we have to invite and enhance public and private investment in the productive sector and make the rural areas more self-sufficient. And we have to address the issue of global food security. We have to address the issue of rural poverty. And also there are greater issues of regional inequality. I have heard from among the audience, a person from Jharkhand has been pointing out the issues that he faces there. So likewise, we have to address several issues, and rural institutions are going to be very instrumental in proactively addressing many of these issues. So in fact, we have to, other than what I have listed, we have to address the issues of resilience, and also we have to address the problems of climate change and other contingent situations, particularly the poor communities in the rural sector are going through. So it is in this context we have to think about how do we strengthen the governance of rural development process as well as rural institution. So it is in this process we have to guarantee that these interventions ensure positive impacts, and we provide new opportunities for the rural communities. And also we have to establish various methods by which we can improve local economies, and we have to aim at the well-being of the rural societies. So when compared to maybe Europe or the North America, the rural setting in India is absolutely different, and we are still to evolve mechanisms so that we can address many of the issues which I have listed right now. So it is in this context I am trying to share a few of my thoughts with you. Maybe as I told you earlier, in connection with what we have envisaged as part of the decentralized framework in India, and also in connection with what the state of Kerala has attempted to do by making use of the provisions of the 73rd and 74th Amendment. So, in fact, see the problems of rural society when we closely look at the issues of rural society, we know that we have to have an immediate concern of reducing vulnerability of these rural societies, and also we have to ensure social inclusion. And to put more briefly, I would say we have to enhance resilience of the rural community, and we have to go for sustainable production system of the rural system in the rural settings. So these are all things which have to be done at a much greater scale, and in order to ensure that the country progresses at a greater pace, we have to ensure that the rural areas also get a major share of what the country is trying to accomplish. But how do you do this? It's a very important question. And we know that rural institutions have assumed importance recently in the context of whatever I have mentioned so far, particularly in view of the various challenges that we face. We have got an onus to ensure that the rural institutions are empowered and strengthened. So, in fact, we have to make these institutions more inclusive, and we should make them agents of rural transformation. So, how do you make these rural institutions more inclusive, and how do you gear up these institutions so that they propagate the process of rural transformation? So how do we do this is an important policy, a question which have to be addressed. Basically, it is a question with the political dimensions, it's a question with the technology dimensions, it's a question with the several policy dimensions. So, in fact, innovative rural institutions have emerged in the rural economies, basically to address various development issues, particularly since the 1990s, since India uh, has chosen the path of liberalization. We have known that there had been several new attempts to ensure that the rural communities are taken care of. Whether that has been effective or not is a question to be answered. There is something which has to be explored further, but still, we can see there has been a huge transition in respect of the structure of rural institutions and also the functions of rural institutions. So we know that the innovative rural institutions, in fact, have emerged as a result of the various emerging requirements, particularly, say, for example, the receding roles of the public sector. This has been a major issue. The public sector has largely tried to withdraw from many of the rural development programs, and allocations have subsided, particularly in response to many of the conditionalities that have been laid down in the aftermath of globalization. And also there had to be a necessity to integrate the rural communities with the regional, national, and international markets, because as Professor Milman said, this market oriented governance has been propagated, and that has been mainstream. They have tried to mainstream this, and this has necessarily prompted us to adopt a few new measures by which these rural communities are integrated into the global market, etc. So basically, we have responded to the changes that have happened around us. And recently, rural institutions have started addressing varied issues, and not only the one which I have listed earlier. We have varied issues and have been proved to be very effective in enhancing several things. Say, for example, the rural institutions have been proved to be effective in enhancing access to management of natural resources, which is a very important thing. See, access to water, access to various other natural resources, access to water bodies, access to the fisheries resources, access to forest. So several rural institutions have emerged to address these issues. And see, for example, another important thing is it has enhanced access to inputs and output markets. So whether you have access to inputs and output markets, there has been a improvement over a period of time particularly the performance of rural institutions to make this happen, or to ensure access to output and input markets had substantially increased. And improving access to information and knowledge, that is a very important thing. You can see several experiments done in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in many parts of North India, where several institutions have been able to provide information, particularly relevant information, to enhance livelihood security of people. So that has been a great accomplishment. And also, they have mostly engaged with the rural communities and small producers. And the rural institutions have tried to engage these small producers and also the rural communities in the process of policy making. So their voices have been noticed, and they have been made to hear. They have to express their concerns. So these are also certain contributions by the rural institutions in India. So, for example, there are several other examples as well. I would tell you a few examples. See, the market associations and cooperatives at the rural sector have been able to help the rural sector negotiate better prices for their produce and access markets. And also, there has been institutions which could facilitate dialogue among smallholder producers, artisan communities, governments, and stakeholders from the private sector. And also, as I told, these rural institutions ensured that rural voices are heard, and pro-poor policies are complementary, and they are comprehensive, and they are well placed and well designed, so that the diverse needs of the rural communities could be heard. In fact, this has been made possible to a large extent by rural institutions. I wanted to emphasize again, underline the significance of rural institutions in this context and in this setting. So, when we think of practical ways of managing rural institutions, we must explore the possibilities of establishing new and robust systems of local governance, because rural institutions can be managed only through a system which is decentralized. I don't think a centralized system would be able to facilitate the rural institutions. There are two issues. One is new institutions have to emerge, and second one is existing institutions have to be strengthened and they have to be sustained. Both these activities can be done only through very robust local governance. So, in fact, across the world, the local governance, whether rural or urban, is all about how decisions that affect a community are made. If you want to devolve power and if you want to enhance decentralization, the only purpose is to ensure that the concerns of the people at the grassroots level are heard in the process of decision making. So there are three important components which we have to consider. One is we have to ensure that there is adequate devolution of powers and responsibilities and financial resources to the regions and locales. So this is very important. Whether you have a system where the political power or the decision-making power, responsibilities, and financial resources to regions and locales are ensured through a legislation. So, in fact, in India, we have started that process. In the 73rd and 74th amendments have envisaged this kind of a transition, and we have facilitated this process, and we have left this to the discretion of the states to come up with their own domestic laws and statutes, so that they can make sure, or they can make use of the provisions of this constitution. So that is a very important thing. When we have made substantial improvement in making a legal framework which ensures this kind of decentralization and local governance. And second one is, how do you ensure that there is a partnership which works between the public sector, the civil society, the non-governmental sector, the private sector, etc. So all these sectors are very important. Even I would say the cooperative sector, for that matter. All these sectors have to be harnessed. And how do you bring all these sectors together? How do you improve synergy, or build synergy, is a very important thing. And the most important thing, the third one, is how do you ensure integration or coordination across sectors and various conflicting interests. This is also very important. How do you ensure that there is coordination between different, so Dr. Muhlman has been talking about silo mentality. So how do you integrate different departments which have got discrete mandates and responsibilities? How do you bring them together? How do you make these their activities complementary. They are very important, and that is I would say, an uphill task. It's a very huge and humongous task on the part of the political parties, on the part of policymakers, administrators, to make this happen at any level, for that, not only at the grassroots level, at any level. So if it is not possible at the higher level, then think of the difficulty involved in this process when you try to do it at the grassroots level. So in fact, this is why the current times demand new governance for the rural areas. It is called new governance in international literature, particularly on meta governance and also the principle of subsidiarity, and particularly in with respect to rural institutions, we talk about a new governance for the rural areas. All the existing governance systems will have to be changed gradually, so that maybe adaptation would be more easy and acclimatization would be easy. That transition would be much less impactful, for that matter. So really want to have a new governance system introduced in the rural areas, and this new governance system should be able to address many of the issues that I have listed earlier. These governance systems should have the knowledge and expertise in key areas. So for example, how do you deal with the issue of climate change is an important issue. How do you deal with the problem of integration with the national market or international market is an important issue. How do you deal with epidemics is an important issue. How do you deal with natural disasters is an important issue. How do you deal with the natural resource management is an important issue. There are ever so many other issues which are coming up, particularly nowadays. Maybe there are emerging issues about which this system should have knowledge. And the second one is that these systems, this governance system, should be trusted by the public. And how do you ensure that these systems are trusted by the public? You can do it only by making sure that the people who are going to be the stakeholders, who are going to be the beneficiaries, are made a part of this process. They have to be made a part of this process. And this would certainly enhance the trust by the public. And also, very important is that this new governance system should be more responsive. Responsive in the sense it should be able to respond to the requirement of the people. So unless it is responsive, unless it is quick in action, unless it is quick in responding to the requirements of the people, these governance systems would prove to be ineffective, and the people's trust would certainly fade away. So this is also very important. And most importantly, it has to be sufficiently representative. That's a very important thing. See, the power equations or the power relations that exist in a rural area in many parts of India are not very congenial. So the power equations that exist in a rural area should not be detrimental to the process that we have put forward. That is this decentralization or new governance program that we have put forward. It should not be affecting adversity. So, for example, if you have got a particular segment which is dominant, and it should not be, it is not ideal that this dominant segment should be represented more. Rather, everybody should have the right to vote, and everybody should have the probability of getting included in the process of decision making. So, it is very difficult in India, I would say, to ensure that this happens in every part of the country. So, and one thing which we have to bear in mind in this context is, see, you are talking about economic development and local governance, and the robustness of local governance. The efficiency of local governance is an important factor in ensuring economic success. So it is a prerequisite that if you really want to progress forward, and if you really want to bring the fruits of development onto the grassroots level, there has to be a robust local governance, and there should be robust rural institutions. So this is the importance of rural institutions and local governance. And I think we may now try to find out how do you make this basically happen? How do you enhance the effectiveness of local governance? So basically, local governance involve fiscal and decision-making autonomy of local public institutions. And we call them as, maybe in India, we call them as, say, for example, Grama Panchayat. We have a 3-tier system in some places. In some places, there are only 2-tier systems. We have the block panchayat, we have the district panchayat, we have the urban and local governments, and with varying responsibilities. So, if you go by the 73rd and 74th Amendment, you can see that all these local bodies in whatever tier they belong to, they have got specific responsibilities. They have got specific domains in which they can work. They have got specific jurisdictions. And how do you improvise the provisions in the 73rd and 74th Amendment is yet another important issue which has to be addressed very, very boldly, I would say. So basically, these amendments envision empowerment of the local governments through devolution of fiscal and administrative powers. And only a few states have attempted comprehensive administrative reforms for empowering local governments. And in those places where these local governments have been empowered enough to undertake many of the developmental functions, we have seen tremendous change. And we have been able to witness there is a resurgence or even emergence of very robust and healthy rural institutions. There has been a substantial improvement in poverty reduction. There has been substantial improvement in public education. There has been substantial improvement in rural development, in health, and ever so many other sectors of development. There has been substantial improvement. So devolution of powers, devolution of financial as well as political decision-making power, and along with maybe establishment or provision to establish rural institutions. So this has been a very important factor which has decided or which has influenced the process of development in many of the rural areas in India. So I would just one by one we will just try to find out how these innovations in rural governance emboldened with the provisions of constitutional amendments work. So I am taking the example of Kerala right now because 25 years back, when or soon after the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments were made effective by the parliament, so the Kerala government came up with an idea of making use of the provisions of the amendments and tried to make its own domestic law, the Kerala Panchayati Raj Act, which tried to improvise many of the provisions. So, for example, there is a question of how do you make this happen? So somebody asked that question to Professor Milman, how can you make this happen? See, there has to be a strong political will which is grounded on various social transformation movements that have happened over a period of time. There has to be some kind of a readiness to do this kind of change, to bring out this kind of change. And Kerala has been fortunate enough to have all these prerequisites. So in that state, they came up with the idea of instituting a new process of decentralization wherein people would be getting adequate opportunity to to express their requirements and concerns, and a process by which these concerns could be translated into development projects. So, in fact, the first thing that was done in Kerala was to transfer a few vital development departments in the productive sector. So, for example, agriculture, animal husbandry, fisheries, health, and service sector, health, education, etc., to the local governments with a dual hierarchy, so that the departments should be having its hierarchy fixed with the concerned department, and the functions would be guided by the local governments. And also, secondly, it was followed by earmarking a definite percentage of the state plan funds for implementing local development plans. So, unless you have money, it is not going to be possible. And third is that a new process was put in place. So, for example, there is a provision for Grama Sabha. Professor Dr. Rujira also mentioned about Grama Sabha. So, what is happening in a Grama Sabha? Basically, the citizens come together and they express their requirements. So, they express their concerns. So, is there any mechanism by which this Grama Sabha deliberations are consolidated and they are translated into development projects? So, if you have a proposal like that, if you have a program to do that, that would be quite easy for you to understand the varied issues of a rural area, so that it is directly expressed by the people. So, a new system for presenting the requirements and aspirations of the people, the citizen forum called Grama Sabha was instituted, and there were working groups led by the professionals of the transferred institution, officers of the transferred institution, to projectize many of the requirements of expressed in the Grama Sabha. So, and also there were we decided to have different avenues for mutual consultation with higher tier local governments and among various stakeholders, and ultimately approval of these project proposals by a technically competent body at the block level and the district level, and an ultimate approval, final approval by the district planning committee, which is again a constitutional authority, a constitutional body which has got immense power to decide upon what should be the course of developmental action in a district. So the district planning committee was also empowered with this kind of jurisdiction and this kind of responsibilities. So basically, this was the basic framework with which decentralization was made possible. So in fact, now we will just try to find out whether this framework has been effective in fostering rural institutions or not. The first and foremost thing is that a new set of rural institutions were formulated as part of this process. Say, for example, there is something called a working group. A working group is a group which would sit together to projectize or to translate the requirements which have been raised in the Gram Sabha into projects. So it is a body wherein the local people would be represented, officials would be represented, politicians would be represented. Say, for example, in education, if there is a working group working on education, it would be able to reflect on various requirements. Say, for example, they want to enhance the learning situation, they want to enhance the standard of teaching, they want to have a new infrastructure facility added on to an existing rural school. All these things are possible. So they can come up with a definite proposal or a project to get money from the local body. And this project would be ultimately approved by a higher technical body at the block level, and it will be ultimately approved by district planning committee. And based on that, that would be given for implementation. So this framework of decentralized planning, this framework of facilitating rural development in a decentralized manner has been able to evolve new rural institutions, and it has strengthened many of the existing rural institutions. So in fact, this experiment in Kerala teaches us several intervention points. It emphasizes, it underlines several intervention points which can be emulated in other parts of the country as well. See, the experience of decentralized planning and implementation through this framework provides us with a few important lessons on governance of rural institutions and creative ways of coordination of different agencies, how to get rid of this silo mentality. So there are certain provisions which addresses this issue of silo mentality or departmentalism, which can integrate many of the activities of different departments to make their activities more complementary and comprehensive. So the first and foremost thing is that governance systems and structures could be reoriented in such a way that there is an issue at the rural area, maybe at the panchayat, and that issue has to be addressed within a span of 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, for which funds have to be earmarked, for which there has to be a strategy, for which technology will have to be applied, for which organizations will have to be formed, for which implementation has to be monitored. So all these processes are required. So an officer who is in charge of this particular sector will be responsible for doing this, and he will be duly assisted by the panchayat. He will be duly assisted by representatives of people. Maybe other departments can also be brought on board to have consultations with this officer, so that there would be some kind of an integration at the grassroots level. So that is one important thing. There has to be a reorientation in the outlook of departments, and it has been made mandatory. Unless you make it mandatory and functional, this would not happen. See, it cannot be brought out and can be made possible just by preaching to them that this is important. You can preach any number of times, and it is not going to be followed unless they have a platform to do this. So this platform will have to be established. This platform will have to be created to elicit their activity, to make sure that they do it properly. So second important lesson is mainstreaming the method of people's participation and stakeholder consultation. So how can you really make this happen? How can you really make people participate in that process? So for example, Grama Sabha is an entry point where people's naive concerns would be expressed, later on also in many of these processes, in working groups, in say for example in formulating the projects, maybe again maybe it's giving it for inspection by a higher technical body, there is more degree of participation. So mainstreaming the participation of people who are the beneficiaries as well as the stakeholder agencies are very important. I would just tell you one example. There is something called a block level bankers committee. A block level bankers committee is a mandatory meeting which has to be held every year before the financial year starts. So this is a place where the local bodies talk to the representatives of the banks about the credit requirement. So there would be cooperative bank, there would be nationalized bank, they would be sitting together, and the credit requirement of a particular beneficiary of a project will be discussed. When at what rate would the credit be available, and what are the different schemes which are which have been formulated by the banks to give credit. All those issues would be discussed. So unless there is a forum to do this kind of multi-stakeholder consultation would not happen. So this is one way of doing that. And the third important lesson which has to be learned from this experience is enhancing the capabilities of local governments to negotiate with various development agencies is very important. So, for example, in Kerala, so there are certain local bodies who have taken up power generation. So you would not believe. There are a few district panchayats and a few grama panchayats who have ventured into power generation. They have established or installed small hydel power stations with the help of a technically competent agency at the state level. So there is a provision that the local bodies can invest in power sector as well. They can have maybe they can have a small hydel project, or they can even think of generating power from non-renewable sources. Renewable sources. So these agencies would require consultation with technical entities. These agencies would require consultation with experts. These agencies would require different types of stakeholder consultation. So how do you enhance the capabilities of local governments to negotiate with development agencies and donor agencies, etc.? Various stakeholders is a very important thing. So basically, this is a very important thing which we have to address. How to enhance the capabilities of local bodies to address many of the issues. I know very well that in Kerala, we have earmarked almost about 27% of the total plan funds to the local bodies. Local bodies are so rich, not only rich on their own resources, but rich in terms of the money that they get from the government as well. But we know very well that in many other parts of the country, they have not been given this kind of fiscal responsibility and this financial freedom. So they are not able to undertake many of these activities. But even with the very little money that they have at their disposal, they would be able to come up with innovative programs. For example, it could be a campaign for cleaning the premises. It could be for a health campaign. It could be on a nutrition issue. It could be something else. Maybe it can be anything for that matter. But there has to be a capability on the part of the local bodies to negotiate with experts and other agencies who are going to come to them. So this is a very important aspect. And see, in fact, if you really want to do this, there have to be extensive program to empower this local government institution. First and foremost, we have to have a system, we have to have processes, we have to have a political will to devolve more money and institutions to the local governments, and also we should be knowing how to make use of the rural institutions and how to manage them. This managerial capability is also very important. So now I think maybe in the light of whatever we have discussed so far, I would just summarize what are the different interventions that would be required to foster rural institutions and also to enhance the robustness of governance and coordination to encourage and to sustain rural institutions. And first and foremost, what I feel is that there has to be extensive awareness programs supported by deliberate attempts to improve the literacy of people on various major development fronts. Say, for example, we are not talking about mere literacy, we are talking about financial literacy, we are talking about digital literacy, we are talking about sanitation literacy, legal literacy, constitution literacy. So you should be aware of the rights and privileges provided by the Constitution of India, which is a legendary Constitution of India. And say, for example, do you have the literacy to make use of water? Do you have literacy on disaster management? So all these important things are very important, because it is based on this awareness that these rural institutions could emerge and sustain. And rural institutions primarily have the responsibility of creating this awareness, and the robustness of these institutions would again would again depend on the general awareness of the people. So the local governments and local leadership should be aware of all these upcoming issues and developmental agenda and various emerging problems that we face. And second important thing is that there has to be proactive public action. This is basically, it need not be civic action alone, it can be political action as well. So there has to be proactive public action. I think this is a very important decisive factor in ensuring efficacy of democratic decentralization and associated processes. Very important, because becoming aware of the support systems at the disposal of the people and how they respond proactively to development needs is very important. So unless there is a proactive, for example, the government declares a particular program, a scheme, development scheme. So do you have any mechanism to ensure that people know about this? Really, whether people do they know about this, whether they have the awareness that we are eligible to get this, we have the privilege and we have the right to get this. So this is a very important thing. So we are only slowly coming towards that kind of a general public awareness which empowers the people. So this is a very important thing, the proactive public action. So that also is a political activity, I would say, because making people aware of their rights and privileges is a very important political action. And this proactive public action is very important in sustaining rural institutions. So integration of activities of various agencies working towards this same direction and goals is also very important. So you have several agencies, several programs working towards the same direction. And how do you integrate the activities of this? So it requires tremendous planning. So for example, you have a watershed program. And how do you make use of the provisions of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program in that massive watershed program is something which has to be technically resolved, something which requires, I would say, extensive consultation among people, something which requires technical know-how. So unless you have the substratum and the forum to discuss these issues technically as well as politically as well as at the policy level, then things would not happen. So rural development basically is multidimensional, and it requires multiple functions to be performed by different agencies. But these several functions which are complementary and they are beneficial to each other, but they are not known to many. So how do you bring on board all these agencies together is a very important thing. So there has to be democratic fora as well as functional platforms so that these agencies can be brought on board. So for example, I would tell you one recent thing that we have done in Kerala. In the State Planning Board is responsible for providing the guidelines for the functioning of local governments. And we have ensured, or we have made it mandatory, that all the development departments will have to present before the Panchayat Council the details of various centrally sponsored schemes and state sponsored schemes. And also, they have to present a strategy as to how to integrate these programs with the programs of the Grama Panchayat. So, for example, you have the MGNRGS program. And how do you really want to integrate this with a program of the Grama Panchayat? Or you have a state-sponsored program called, say, vegetable production, or maybe a sanitation program. So how do you integrate this with the requirement of the local body? So what actually happens is the local leadership comes to know about the prospects of these programs, the extensive nature of this program, how much money is available, and what's the mode of implementation of these programs, and what are the different lacunae or constraints that these agencies are likely to face. And they would also try to understand how these programs could be complemented, or which can be auxiliary, or which can be linked or integrated with the requirement of the village. And also they would be able to maybe to enrich some of the aspects with their own funds. So that kind of integration is quite possible. So if there is a platform for these people to come and present it, and it becomes a mandatory provision, and it becomes a prerequisite for approval by a higher authority, then I think this integration would would happen to a great extent. So there are also, I would say, I mentioned it briefly about new institutions which have come up as part of this process. We have across the country, we have the producer organization, which are all new institutions which are trying to address the issue of less productivity and integration with the global market, etc. So they have become all the more all pervasive. I think across the country, we have the farmer producer organizations and other producers organization, which is a very vital rural institution for that matter. We have several community-based organizations. In Kerala, we have the Kudumbashri, which is one of the largest network of women self-help groups, which have got thousands of crores turnover in their activities, which have gone into new areas of development. We have got even technoparks, right from technoparks to hotel chains. Kudumbashri is involved in several activities. So they are all new institutions that have come up as part of decentralization. And decentralization is paying back by sustaining these institutions through various means. So this is a one-to-one relationship which these institutions and the governance have got. So this is very important. How do you establish this one-to-one relationship? New institutions are created, and these new institutions are maintained by the very process of democratic decentralization. And there are also new institutions of social justice and gender equity. We have the Jagrada Samitis, Women Fora, and we have for the disabled, we have the Bud School. Bud School is an innovation to take care of the disabled, a lot of the disabled sections of the society. And also we have geriatric care centers, palliative care centers, etc., etc. All these institutions have been newly formed, and these institutions have been greatly of great help to the state in dealing with, say, for example, the COVID situation, the epidemic, and also during the floods that we had recently experienced. So all these institutions at the rural sector, all these institutions, which are maybe, I would not say they are all highly empowered, they are only partly empowered. Some are in the initial stages of its origin, somehow already gathered some momentum. So there are different varying degrees of development. But the network of all these institutions have been quite useful in dealing with many of the contingent situations the state had to face. So particularly, I recall the great service provided by these rural institutions in helping people during the COVID times, in providing them with food kits, providing them with vaccines, giving them medical care, etc., etc. So I think with this I would stop. This is very important to coordinate rural institutions for developing a synergy. Discrete actions would not be effective. We have to integrate the activities of these institutions, for which there has to be a democratic fora, as well as there has to be very serious attempts to provide the local governments with the three Fs. Somebody was referring to that, the three Fs, the funds as well as the facilities, and also the financial response, the functions and functionaries. All these have to be transferred to the local bodies. So it's very important. And also there must be a definite process of translating the results of such interactions and consultation into action points at various decision-making levels. And the beneficiaries and end users should have adequate opportunities to reflect on the impact of interventions intended to serve them. And there must be effective audit systems, I would say. There must be effective audit systems at the local level to audit the performance of various interventions initiated by not only the local government, but also by other agencies. And also, and most importantly, again, I would emphasize, all the local government institutions and local institutions have to be trained adequately to handle with emerging issues. Particularly, they should have the technical know-how how to deal with the problems of problems posed by the Sustainable Development Goals, integrating them with the markets, and how do you integrate the value chain management? How do you provide support for poverty reduction, and there were so many other things which are coming in. So this is all what I have to reflect on the significance of local governments, and how do local governments empower rural institutions, and what kind of coordination is required to strengthen rural institutions. I am very much thankful to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk to you. In fact, it's unfortunate that I could not give a PowerPoint presentation, because I thought that it is going
It's
to happen.
perfectly fine, Professor Alex. I think we
Thank
will
you so much.
write down. I mean, after every webinar, of course, we note down and report it in our. We have this proceeding that comes out, and we'll
So I
rally.
would be able to, I would be able to maybe give you a write up on this. Maybe that also would be
Yes,
possible.
that will also be very, very much welcome. So let me first thank you for this detailed discussion. I mean, it's in fact, I was just speaking to Dr. Partha, who is also here. It's like listening to a story when we listen to you, and it was so pleasant to hear. And very clearly, you have kind of linked it up with all the aspects of development. And I'm sure that our participants also learned a lot. There were a lot of hand raised in the chat box, and there are a lot of questions. So, without much delay, I want to open the panel now for question and answer. And I have, I mean, turned on the feature where you can turn on your own microphone. So, my request is that one by one, please raise your hand and unmute yourself before you ask the question. I see a hand raised from Stuti Gupta. Maybe we can start with her. Ms. Stuti Gupta. Mr. Prabhakar Singh, can you unmute and ask?
जी मैं हिंदी में बात करना चाहूँगा।
जी 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 प्लीज।
कोई बात नहीं,
जी
I can also
मैं
understand.
जितना समझ पाया, मेरे मन में एक सवाल आया और मैं कुछ सामाजिक कार्यकर्ता के रूप में काम भी कर रहा हूँ कि गांव स्तर पे जो ग्राम पंचायतों में कर्मचारी हैं, जिनके माध्यम से ग्राम पंचायतें काम कर सकती हैं, उनको सतत विकास लक्ष्य का जो पंचायती राज ने लोकलाइज करके 9 विषयों में बनाया है, इसकी जानकारी विधिवत प्रशिक्षण की आवश्यकता है। मैंने ऐसा महसूस किया। उनके बीच जब हम काम करना चाहते हैं वो कहते हैं ये है क्या, ये नहीं हो सकता। 99% स्थिति ये है। जी धन्यवाद। यही जानना चाहता हूँ इसके लिए क्या होगा।
So I could not get it fully, but can you just tell me the crux of what he said?
Quickly, I'll translate. So he's saying that these 9 areas that are aligned to the SDG that has been identified by the Panchayati Raj Minister of Panchayati Raj, and the villages have to take it up at
Yeah.
their own level. But when they are trying to actually go to the field and trying to take up the work with in consultation with the local agencies or local governance, they understand that there is basically no awareness around these 9 areas, and most of the cases the response is that this cannot happen and we don't know what you're talking about. So in that case, so when there is zero awareness at the level, how do you even take up the work and start? I mean, how do you even talk about achievement when there is no awareness to begin with? So how he's
So
saying that
that,
there is probably a training or an awareness needed, and that's what he feels, and he wants your comment on that.
so in fact, that is one reason why I emphasized on public action and creating awareness. That is very important. It's
Yes.
not just mere political awareness or political leniency to one party or so. Rather, it should be something which is beyond that. So you should be able to understand what are your rights. You should be aware of what are your privileges and also the entitlements that you have from the government. So in fact, the evolution of these 9 sectors, as reported by him, 9 areas which have to be addressed by the local bodies, So if the local bodies are not even aware of that, then what is the fun of maybe going to such people? So that is one reason why I told, there has to be a superstructure, particularly promulgated by the government to have these systems built up. So unless you have that administrative framework in which the systems can be built up, there is no point in talking about institutions. So this is what happens in Africa and other places, where many of I do not know properly, but still I think many of the donor agencies who are working with the African continent, etc. They come up and say that there are no government systems at all, no systems in the public sector at all. So, so it is in such circumstances these donor agencies have to be depended on. Say, for example, a donor agency from an international agency come out to that place and start doing something, or a non-government organization start something, and leave those efforts unfinished, and then they leave the place. And once they leave the place, and that system would deteriorate, nothing would be there remaining. So it is not a question of doing something for the sake of people. Rather, it is a question of having sustainable systems on hand. And that can happen, I firmly believe, that can happen only in the public sector. So unless the government does something to put in place proper structures or the substratum, I would say, then these institutions cannot grow at all. Then it would be directly led to the vagaries of the market. So the market forces would be having their say. And what happens is that would lead to more inequality and more, I would say, inegalitarian distribution of resources and so many other things, which is going to be detrimental to the rural areas in the long run. And that would certainly enhance migration to the urban areas as well. So I think these are all very fundamental things. I don't have a definite answer. Unless you have the systems instituted by the government, it is not going to be addressed.
Let me invite Professor Anida Brandon. I see her hand raised. Professor Brandon, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Dr. Anida Brandon, am I audible?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you. So it was a very interesting expose by Professor Alex and very enlightening. I would like to share my concerns, Professor Alex, and what do you want to respond to these? While in the country we have been speaking of decentralization ever since now we are into 30 years completed of 73rd Constitutional Amendment. We speak decentralization, but increasingly there is a tendency to centralize everything. For example, every ministry, beginning with rural development, Panchayati Raj, every other ministry has their dashboard-driven style of management these days, where all Gram Sabha proceedings, the Gram Panchayat development plans, all have to be showcased on their portals, on their dashboards. And it is increasingly a dashboard-driven management of targets and goals. We have a separate portal for localizing SDGs, separate portal for Gram Sabha proceedings and video recording, GPDP, etc., etc. On the other hand, when we look at the Central Finance Commission fund flow or the State Finance Commission fund flow, they are all tied up with their own guidelines. Resultantly, despite the Mission Antyodaya survey that we have been promoting from the central level from 2018, I think, and the People's Plan campaign, where we started with some 40 parameters, 40 odd parameters. Now we have increased to more than 140 parameters, and we have this nationwide survey at the GP level to then share the survey at the Gram Sabha and then do the gap analysis and then prepare the GPDP, the Gram Panchayat Development Plan. But then when we are told of the progress made and the funds invested at the end of each survey and at the end of each PPC or GPDP cycle, we again are stumped on the same scenario that increasingly funds are invested on infrastructure development, at best on sanitation, water, because schemes, fund flow and guidelines are tied accordingly, where they are supposed to, panchayats are supposed to spend on these. So then health and education and other aspects, software aspects take a back seat and there is no fund investment and no further progress. So the thing is that why can't we have true untied fiscal devolution? Why can't we have panchayats showcasing their own initiatives and their own planning at the local level after 30 years of local governance strengthening? Why do we have to all the time shepherd them into a blueprint model of central ministries descending on them with targets, with goals, with blueprints, and then they have to fit into those? That is one concern. Now, at the end of your expose, you talked about importance of training and capacity building. And I was alarmed to read recently, and a parliamentary committee also took the Ministry of Panchayati Raj was shaken on this, that out of 28 states in the country, 19 states have been denied the capacity building funds under RGSA in the current financial year. Now, if fund flow doesn't happen in a streamlined manner, in a time-bound manner, how will training and capacity building be strengthened? How will funds be invested judiciously for holistic development and focusing more on health, like you talked of water literacy, digital literacy, disaster management, health literacy, and so on. So panchayats to be weird to focus more on human development than on infrastructure development will happen only when we allow them that leverage to really take local decisions on priorities felt locally. So these are few concerns that I wanted to raise, because I feel alarmed that more and more we are tying them panchayats down with dashboard driven style of management with top down goals and targets. Thank you.
So, in fact, I absolutely agree with almost 99% of what you have said, because this over centralization is killing the very philosophy and principle of decentralization. So, this is a fallout of, I would sometimes say, it is a fallout of the information technology, wherein everything can be digitized and everything can be monitored at a higher level, which would take away much of the freedom that you are likely to or you are supposed to enjoy. So that issue set apart. In fact, this is basically because in many places the funds for the panchayats have been mostly from the central government, which is tied with all these kinds of conditionalities. They are sector based and also they are tied to a large extent. The local bodies do not have the freedom to improvise upon many of the things other than what is prescribed. So the only way out, as far as my knowledge goes, my understanding goes, the only way out is to uh, ensure that the state should be able to earmark a definite amount of money at free will to the local bodies. So, but even the Kerala's experience is that we are giving almost about 27% of the total plan funds at the disposal of the local bodies, and it is in addition to what we get from the centrally sponsored schemes. We also have all these tied programs. Some of them are not contextual for that matter, because, say for example, you give a few prescriptions which may not be suitable for a particular state. It is basically there is no provision for customization of the provisions most of the time. So you are bound to take up many projects which are not suitable, which are not required at some point of time. So such issues are there. I think that requires a much greater policy debate. But even in addition to that, the state government itself is giving almost about 27. That we have a plan to increase it up to 30%. So this money can be freely spent by the local bodies, but with some regulations. I would not say that everything is for free, because there are certain issues which have to be addressed. Say, for example, Grama panchayats and ward members would be mostly interested in construction activities, which would lead to some kind of obviously corruption. So in such cases, we prescribe that the money should not be spent for construction. It should not be more than 30%. Like, you can have construction only up to 30% of the total funds which we give, and we also insist that 30% should be necessarily mandatorily spent in the productive sector, so that agriculture and allied sectors would improve. You can go up to even 100%, there is no problem, but minimum 30% has to be there on productive sector. And we also insist that, say for example, we only give broad contours. Say for example, we say 10% of the total funds have to be specifically for women. That is called the women component plan kind of a thing. So we make sure that 10% invariably goes for women. So likewise, small allocations, which are broad allocations, you have the freedom to do anything under that. But in order to insist some restrictive practices, which are going to be otherwise, which are going to be, I would say, which are not going to be very encouraging, we try to insist on a few things. So I think this is the only way you can give more freedom to the local governments, because I do not, I am no one to reflect on the attitude of the central government and the way in which they tie up many of the funds with prescribed national goals. They have the right to do that. They can even give that money to the local body straight. That's a different issue altogether. But if you really want to have money at the disposal of the local governments, the state government should be able to earmark some money at their disposal so that they can freely spend, and maybe based on broad guidelines. That is my answer to that.
Thank you so much, Professor Alex. I hope, Professor Brandon, you have your reply. And of course, as Professor Alex is saying, it's a much larger policy debate than this one discussion. I see there is another hand raised by Shri Ampakumar Hembram. I will request you to unmute and ask your question. And this is the last question I'm afraid because we have taken a lot of time, and there are a few more comments in the chat box. I'll read out after your question.
जवाहर सर, मैं अंपा कुमार हेम्ब्रम, असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर, डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ संताली, गवर्नमेंट कॉलेज सालबोनी, जो वेस्ट बंगाल मेदिनीपुर में है। और तभी मैंने बताया था मैं जमशेदपुर से हूँ। एक्चुअली मैं आपने जो कहा लोकल गवर्नेंस, एक्चुअली मैं लिटरेचर फील्ड से हूँ, लेकिन रूरल डेवलपमेंट के लिए कुछ काम भी करता हूँ। गांव-गांव में घूम के अवेयरनेस प्रोग्राम करता हूँ। तो मैं जितने भी गांव में गया हूँ उसके वीडियो में यूट्यूब में शेयर भी किया हूँ। लोकल में आपने जो कहा अवेयरनेस की एकदम बहुत ही मतलब लो लेवल, उनको पता ही नहीं है ई ग्राम स्वराज क्या है, वहाँ आपके फंड कैसे मतलब आपका जो स्कीम पास हुआ है क्या, वो भी नहीं पता। जीपीडीपी कैसे बनता है उनको कुछ पता ही नहीं है। जो भी काम होता है लोकल, जो आपने कहा पॉलिटिकल लीडर या पॉलिटिकल इन्फ्लुएंस जो लोग होते हैं उनके द्वारा होते हैं। तो मैं आपसे एक सवाल पूछना चाहता हूँ कि क्या ऐसा सेंट्रली या स्टेट ऐसा कोई इंस्टीट्यूशन या काउंसिल है जिससे हम लोग अवेयरनेस का काम करा सके? क्योंकि मैं खुद चाहता हूं कि मुझे उनका सपोर्ट मिले, ताकि मैं तो अपने जिस दिन मेरा छुट्टी रहता है उस दिन मैं काम करता हूं। तो वैसा मुझे अगर सपोर्ट मिल जाए तो लोकल लेवल में इसका अवेयरनेस का काम किया जा सकता है। तो क्या ऐसा कोई काउंसिल या इंस्टीट्यूशन है?
Okay. See, one thing is that this awareness cannot be generated all of a sudden overnight. That is why I emphasize the issue of public action. Basically, it should be an evolutionary process by which people get more political awareness and they become more literate and they become more and more aware of what they are entitled to get. That is a very important thing which can happen only over a period of time. Unless there are very concrete attempts and deliberate attempts on the part of the political parties to make people aware, then this would not happen. So the kind of GPDP and all these kinds of things, I do not know how. I would at least at some places it is premature for that matter, because people do not know the mechanism even, and they don't have funds and they don't have the systems which I have been talking about. Maybe that should not. I saw from the chat box there was somebody who was saying that God's own country, the whatever is done in God's own country cannot be done in other places. That is a misnomer, because I don't believe in God's own country and that kind of stuff which we talk about Kerala and all that. That's not a absolutely. That is, I would not say, I would not agree with that. Basically, it's a question of whether how the state has tried to put in place certain systems, and that has been an evolutionary process. That was the end point, or maybe that was at some point of time we have been able to make this happen through various social transformation initiatives which have happened much earlier, and the soil was ripe enough to sow the seeds of decentralization. But how to make the soil ripe enough to sow the seeds of this kind of rural innovations or whatever innovations that you talk about is a very important thing. So how far these people would take and how far these states would take and how much time is going to take for this is a different question altogether. So that is one thing. And second one is regarding the institution which he has been talking about. Maybe I would say I think the NIPR itself is an institution which can provide awareness, and we have the state level institutions as well. And also there is a gap in that, maybe to provide large scale awareness building program across the country to functionaries, to people's representatives, to local politicians, to activists, etc., on decentralization, rural development, and how rural institutions can fare in this context. I think these are all very important. Learn on their own, unless there are deliberate attempts to teach people about the requirements and also the significance of these institutions. I don't think we would take more time to reach our goals. That is what I feel. So I mean, I think we have the Kerala Institute of Local Administration, which teaches you a lot about decentralization. That's a very excellent institution where many people from across the country come and learn. And we have full-fledged. You can go to the website of the Kerala Institute of Local Administration. We have got public awareness program and degree programs, certificate courses, etc., on various dimensions of decentralization. We have got an open university which is affiliated with this institution. We also run courses on decentralization. We give certificate courses and diploma courses on decentralization to local government representatives, political leaders, etc. Anybody can approach them and enroll maybe to have their resources. But the problem is language could be a problem. I don't know. There is a Hindi version. Most of them would be in vernacular, and some of them would be in English.
Thank you, Professor Alex, for addressing that. In fact, what Mr. Hemram was saying earlier, I have one last question and then we'll close it because we have a lot of time, we don't have much time left. I wanted to know, like, I just see this whole idea that they're saying that only political people know about these GPDP, etc., and people in governance. I mean, can we really, I don't know, can we create these two binaries, that political versus the people? I mean, should we not be talking about it in kind of a holistic manner? And should we really isolate the political from what is considered not political? How will you, I mean, Kerala being the prime example probably, because your public action, your history of public action is very, very political in nature, and
Absolutely.
that's a success
Absolutely.
story. So this whole, I mean, I just see these states like Jharkhand, etc., in all these states, there is this whole idea that politics is bad and political should not be part of this. So maybe that's one part of the problem that we need to start talking about, that I mean, can we really isolate the two and talk about development
No, I don't think it has to be isolated. They are one and the same, I would say. Any developmental activity is political in nature.
Yes.
And the ideology is a different thing altogether. But when it comes to the political activism, it is not just a parliamentary political activism. We are talking about something different. That is, empowering people itself has got politics on its own. And empowering people and telling them about their rights and requirements and privileges and entitlements itself is a political activity. That's a very important thing. You cannot keep political parties aloof from that. I think in Kerala, at least, we would say every party is aware of the prospects of decentralization.
Right.
So it is not only done by one single party. Mostly the 50% by one party, maybe 40% by another party, 10% by another party. So each party gets a opportunity to serve the people through their own ways through their own ways by making use of this decentralized system. So if this system is not there, one party would not be getting any representation at all. But in a decentralized system, all the parties get some sort of representation in serving the people. That's what I have seen. It should not be seen separately. Rather, they are one and the same. This is not a binary. Rather, I think it's a continuum kind of a thing.
Exactly. I was also thinking the same thing, because that's very, I mean, very distinct in how the description comes up, that only political agents are taking up. It's not, we should not see it that way, I think.
No, I don't know. Maybe the political parties would be responsible for what they are doing. That's a different thing altogether. But ideologically speaking, theoretically speaking, it is nothing but politics.
Yes.
It is political awareness which leads to this kind of. They're all political structures. This is basically an outcome and output of our democracy, our constitution, basically. So constitution is a political product, basically. So I don't know how can you separate or differentiate between these two.
Totally agreed. I'm very sorry, but I'll have to wind up the discussion here today. We have taken a lot of time and we have to wind it up. So on behalf of National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj, I really thank Professor Alex for his time and, discussing it in such great detail and also engaging with our participants. I see that Dr. Partha is still there. So I would like to invite him if you have last comments, Dr. Partha.
No, you can wrap up, Ruchira.
Okay, thank you. So let us wrap up the discussion today. We discussed about our SDG 17 and SDG 16 and how participation, coordination, all these structures are important for achieving the goals that we have together at the local governance level. And this webinar, let me just announce that this is the last thematic webinar of our evidence-based policy series. We have been having these webinars for some time. We had 11 webinars before this, and this is the last thematic webinar. After that, we are going to wind it up in a concluding webinar. The 14th webinar will be the last concluding webinar of the series. And based on this series, we want to bring out a handbook of rural development policy, at which level I will reach out to all our speakers and all our panelists and other experts who have engaged with us regularly and take your inputs while developing this outcome. So on behalf of our participants in NIRD-PR, I again thank Professor Alex for his time. I thank all my participants for engaging with us for so long and always being here with us and engaging with such active enthusiasm. And I thank Professor Brandon also for bringing out the other dimension of this discussion so beautifully. And we will meet you in the last session, the last webinar, sometime March or sometime in April. I'll be announcing the date shortly. And with that, thank you very much. A very good afternoon to you, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ruchira. Thank you. Thank you.